Jake thought he was going crazy. For the third time this week, he walked out to his backyard pool and found wet footprints on the concrete deck. Not his footprints. These were smaller, with a distinctive flip-flop pattern that he definitely didn't recognize. He stood there in his pajamas, coffee mug in hand, staring at the evidence. The morning sun was just starting to warm up the Arizona suburb where he'd moved 6 months ago. This house was supposed to be his fresh start after the divorce. His own little piece of paradise with a sparkling blue pool that he'd dreamed about during all those years stuck in a cramped apartment. Jake rubbed his eyes and looked again. The footprints led from the side gate around the pool and back to the gate. Someone had definitely been here. But who? And more importantly, why? He'd noticed other strange things too. His pool chemicals seemed to be running low faster than they should. The pH strips he used to test the water kept showing levels that didn't match what he remembered from the day before. And yesterday morning he could have sworn his pool float was in a different position than where he'd left it. At first he figured maybe he was just being paranoid. Moving to a new neighborhood, dealing with all the stress of the divorce, maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But these footprints were real. He could see them clear as day, still slightly damp in the early morning air. Jake walked around the pool, following the trail. His backyard was pretty private, surrounded by a 6-foot wooden fence. The previous owners had done a nice job with the landscaping, too. Palm trees and desert plants created natural barriers between his yard and the neighbors, so how was someone getting in? He checked the side gate first. It was locked, just like he'd left it the night before. The latch was secure, and there were no signs that anyone had climbed over. The fence was too high for most people to just hop over anyway. He walked the perimeter of his yard looking for loose boards or gaps, but everything seemed solid. That's when he spotted it. Near the back corner of the fence, close to where his property line met the community walking trail, one of the fence boards was slightly loose at the bottom. Not obviously broken, but if someone knew exactly where to push, they could probably squeeze through. Jake knelt down and examined the board more closely. The wood was definitely worn at the base, like someone had been wiggling it loose over time. When he pressed on it, it moved enough to create a gap about the size of a person. His heart started beating faster. Someone had been sneaking into his yard, into his private space, using his pool without permission. He thought about calling the police, but what would he tell them? Someone left wet footprints by my pool? They'd probably think he was nuts. He needed more evidence. Jake spent the rest of the morning trying to figure out who might be doing this. He barely knew any of his neighbors yet. When he'd moved in, a few people had stopped by to introduce themselves, but he'd been so busy with work and getting settled that he hadn't really made friends. There was Mrs. Patterson next door, a sweet elderly lady who brought him cookies on his first week. She seemed harmless enough, and besides, the footprints were way too big to be hers. On the other side lived a young family with 2 small kids. The husband, Danny, had helped him move his couch when the delivery guys couldn't get it through the front door. Nice people, but again, the footprints didn't match. Then there was the house across the street. Jake had noticed a woman there who seemed to spend a lot of time outside, always watching what was going on in the neighborhood. She had short blonde hair and usually wore bright-colored clothes that you could spot from a mile away. He'd waved at her a few times, but she'd never waved back. Actually, now that he thought about it, she'd been pretty interested in his house during the moving process. He'd caught her staring several times while he was unloading boxes. And once, when he was testing his pool equipment for the first time, he'd noticed her standing at her front window watching. Jake decided to do a little investigating. He spent his lunch break looking up his neighborhood online. That's when he discovered something interesting. His street had an active homeowners association, and according to their website, the president was someone named Linda Walsh. The photo showed a blonde woman who looked suspiciously familiar. He clicked through more pages and found meeting minutes from the past few months. Linda's name appeared constantly, usually in connection with complaints about various homeowners. Apparently, she was very concerned about property values and community standards. One set of minutes particularly caught his attention. From just 2 months ago, there was a discussion about pool safety and community oversight. Linda had proposed that the HOA should have the right to inspect any backyard pools to ensure they met community standards. The proposal had been voted down, but the minutes noted that Linda had been disappointed by the decision. Jake leaned back in his office chair, pieces starting to fall into place. Could the HOA president really be sneaking into his yard to use his pool? It seemed crazy, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. That evening, Jake decided to do some reconnaissance of his own. He took his dog, Buddy, for a walk around the neighborhood. Buddy was a golden retriever he'd adopted right after the divorce, and the dog loved exploring new places. As they walked past Linda's house, Jake tried to look casual while observing. The house was well maintained, with a perfectly manicured front yard and decorative flags hanging from the porch. But there was no pool. In fact, as he looked around the neighborhood, he realized that very few houses had pools. His was actually one of the nicest ones on the street. When he got home, Jake found something that made his blood boil. There, sitting on his patio table, was a half-empty bottle of sunscreen. Definitely not his brand. Someone had not only been using his pool, but had been making themselves completely at home. He picked up the bottle, his hands shaking with anger. This had gone way too far. Someone was treating his private property like their personal resort. Jake made a decision. Tomorrow he was going to catch whoever was doing this. He'd take the day off work if he had to. Set up somewhere where he could watch his backyard without being seen. And when he caught them in the act, he'd have all the evidence he needed to put a stop to this once and for all. As he got ready for bed that night, Jake felt a mix of anger and anticipation. Someone thought they could just help themselves to his property, but they were about to learn a very hard lesson. He'd worked too hard for this house, this pool, this new life, to let some entitled neighbor ruin it for him. Little did he know, tomorrow would bring revelations that would shock him even more than finding mysterious footprints by his pool. Jake called in sick to work the next morning. He positioned himself at his bedroom window, which gave him a perfect view of his backyard. He'd made coffee and settled in with his laptop, pretending to work while keeping one eye on the pool area. By 9:30, he was starting to think maybe he'd scared off whoever had been using his pool. Then he heard it. The soft creak of his side gate opening. Jake's heart jumped. He moved closer to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. And then he saw her. It was definitely Linda Walsh from across the street. She was wearing a bright pink swimsuit and carrying a large beach bag. But what shocked Jake the most was how comfortable she looked. This wasn't someone sneaking around nervously. This was someone who acted like she belonged there. Linda walked straight to his pool like she owned the place. She set her bag down on his patio table, right next to where he'd found the sunscreen bottle the night before. Then she pulled out a large inflatable float and began setting it up. Jake grabbed his phone and started recording. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This woman was treating his backyard like her personal vacation spot. Linda finished inflating the float and tossed it into the pool. Then she walked over to his outdoor refrigerator, the one he'd splurged on because he loved the idea of having cold drinks right by the pool. She opened it up and helped herself to one of his sodas. That's when Jake lost it. He stormed downstairs and out the back door. "Excuse me," he shouted. "What do you think you're doing?" Linda looked up from where she was adjusting her float, completely unfazed. She actually smiled at him. "Oh, hello there," she said pleasantly. "You must be Jake. I'm Linda Walsh, HOA president. I was just conducting a routine inspection of your pool area." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Inspection? You're wearing a swimsuit." Linda laughed like he'd said something amusing. "Well, you can't properly inspect a pool without testing the water quality. I need to make sure everything meets our community standards." "Community standards?" Jake's voice was getting louder. "This is my private property. You can't just come in here whenever you want." Linda's smile faded slightly. She climbed out of the pool and walked over to him, dripping water all over his deck. "Listen, sweetie," she said, her tone now condescending. "I've been the HOA president here for 8 years. I know these rules better than anyone. Your pool is clearly visible from the street, which means it falls under community oversight." Jake looked toward his house. "Visible from the street? Are you kidding me? There's a 6-foot fence around my entire yard. If you stand on the sidewalk and look between the fence slats, you can see part of the pool," Linda said matter-of-factly. "That makes it a community concern. I have every right to ensure it's being maintained properly. By swimming in it," Jake couldn't hide his sarcasm. "By testing it," Linda corrected. "Water quality, chemical balance, safety features. All of that requires hands-on inspection." Jake pulled out his phone and showed her the video he'd just taken. "This shows you drinking my soda and using my pool float." "That's not an inspection, that's trespassing." Linda's eyes narrowed when she saw the phone. I certainly hope you're not planning to post that anywhere. We have very strict rules about social media in this neighborhood. Anything that could damage our community's reputation is strictly forbidden. You've got to be kidding me. I'm completely serious. And while we're talking about rules, I noticed you have security cameras pointed at your pool area. Those need to be removed immediately. Jake felt like he was in some kind of alternate reality. Why would I remove my security cameras? They're unsightly and they violate our aesthetic standards. Plus, they make other residents uncomfortable. No one wants to feel like they're being watched. Maybe because you're sneaking into my yard. Linda ignored his outburst and walked back to her beach bag. She pulled out a clipboard and started writing. I'm also noticing some maintenance issues, she said. Your pool deck has water spots, there are leaves in the skimmer basket, and these patio chairs don't match the approved outdoor furniture colors. Jake watched in amazement as she continued writing. Are you seriously giving me violations right now? I'm documenting areas that need attention. You'll receive the official notice in a few days. Linda finished writing and tore off a copy of whatever she'd written. Here's your preliminary report. Jake took the paper and read it. She'd actually written him up for inadequate pool maintenance, unauthorized security equipment, and failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. This is insane, he said. You can't issue violations for made-up reasons. I've been doing this for 8 years, Linda repeated. I think I know what I'm doing. She packed up her float and gathered her things. I'll be back next week for a follow-up inspection. Please make sure these issues are addressed by then. As she headed toward the gate, Jake called after her. Stay off my property. I'm changing the locks on that gate. Linda paused and turned back to him. That gate needs to remain accessible for HOA inspections. Blocking HOA access is a violation that can result in fines up to $500. After she left, Jake stood in his backyard, staring at the violation notice in his hand. He felt like he'd just been hit by a truck. In the span of 10 minutes, he'd gone from catching a trespasser to somehow being the one in trouble. He called his neighbor Danny, hoping to get some insight into how the HOA worked around here. Oh man, you met Linda, Danny said when Jake explained what had happened. Yeah, she's intense. Intense. She was swimming in my pool. That sounds about right. She's done stuff like that before. Last year, she decided my kid's swing set was too colorful and violated the aesthetic standards. She actually climbed into my backyard to measure it. Why doesn't anyone stop her? Danny sighed. Because she makes life miserable for anyone who crosses her. Trust me, it's easier to just go along with whatever she wants. She's got the whole HOA board scared of her. But this is illegal, right? Trespassing? Probably, but good luck proving it. She'll just say she was conducting official HOA business. And she's got friends at the city council, so even if you called the cops, it might not go anywhere. Jake hung up, feeling even more frustrated. It seemed like Linda had created her own little kingdom, where she could do whatever she wanted. That evening, Jake researched everything he could find about HOA laws and property rights. What he discovered made him even angrier. Linda was completely wrong about most of the rules she'd cited, but she was counting on him not knowing that. His pool wasn't visible from the street. He'd checked from every angle. Even if it was, that didn't give the HOA the right to trespass. And there was definitely nothing in the HOA bylaws about banning security cameras. But Jake also learned something disturbing. Linda had been filing complaints and violations against homeowners for years, and most people just paid the fines rather than fight back. She'd created a system where she could basically do whatever she wanted, and people were too intimidated to challenge her. As Jake went to bed that night, he made a decision. He wasn't going to be another homeowner who just rolled over and let Linda walk all over him. If she wanted to play games, he'd play games too. But he was going to make sure he won. He had no idea that Linda was about to escalate things far beyond what he could have imagined. Jake thought changing the locks on his gate would solve the problem. He was wrong. The next Tuesday morning, he found his gate standing wide open. The new lock was lying on the ground, clearly cut with bolt cutters. Fresh footprints led from the gate to his pool, and this time Linda hadn't come alone. His security camera footage told the whole story. Linda had arrived at 8 in the morning with 2 other women. One looked to be about her age and the other was younger, maybe in her 30s. They'd spent over an hour in his backyard, using his pool, his patio furniture, and even his outdoor grill. Jake watched the footage in disbelief. The three women had treated his backyard like their private club. They'd rearranged his patio furniture to create a better conversation area. They'd used his pool towels, which were now missing, and they'd left trash everywhere, empty soda cans, snack wrappers, and what looked like the remains of sandwiches they'd made using his outdoor kitchen. But the worst part was what happened at the end of the video. As they were leaving, Linda had deliberately knocked over his potted plants and scattered the soil across his deck. It wasn't an accident. She'd looked directly at the camera while she did it. Jake immediately drove to the hardware store and bought heavier-duty locks, along with a steel chain. If Linda wanted to play this game, he'd make it as difficult as possible for her. That afternoon, while he was installing the new security measures, his doorbell rang. It was a courier with an official-looking envelope. Inside was a formal violation notice from the HOA, signed by Linda Walsh. Jake was being fined $250 for unauthorized gate modifications, another $100 for blocking HOA access, and an additional $50 for failure to maintain outdoor cleanliness standards. The letter also informed him that he had 10 days to remove his security cameras or face additional fines of $100 per day. Jake crumpled up the notice and threw it across his living room. This was getting ridiculous. He called the HOA's management company, hoping to speak to someone reasonable. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Walsh has full authority to issue violations," the representative told him. "If you'd like to dispute the charges, you can request a hearing with the board, but that has to go through Mrs. Walsh first. She's the one issuing the violations." "How is that fair?" "I understand your frustration, sir. But that's how the process works. Mrs. Walsh has been very effective at maintaining community standards." Jake hung up and immediately started researching lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. The consultation fees alone were going to cost him hundreds of dollars, and there was no guarantee he'd win. Meanwhile, Linda's intrusions were getting bolder. She showed up Thursday morning with what appeared to be a pool maintenance kit. Jake watched from his window as she tested his water chemistry, added chemicals from her own supplies, and then spent an hour swimming laps. When he confronted her this time, she had her response ready. "Your pool chemistry was dangerously imbalanced," she told him. "As HOA president, I have a duty to prevent health hazards that could affect the entire community." "How is my pool chemistry a community health hazard?" "Improperly maintained pools can breed bacteria and attract mosquitoes. That affects everyone in the neighborhood." Jake pointed to his pool, which was crystal clear and obviously well maintained. "There's nothing wrong with my pool." "There is now," Linda said smugly. "I've brought it up to proper standards." She handed him another violation notice. This one was for failure to properly maintain pool chemistry and carried a fine of $300. "You can't fine me for something and then fix it yourself. I can, and I did. The violation stands because the problem existed. The fact that I corrected it doesn't eliminate your responsibility." Jake realized he was dealing with someone who had completely perverted the entire HOA system for her own benefit. Linda had found a way to make every situation work in her favor, no matter what he did. The next morning, Jake found evidence that Linda had been in his yard overnight. His outdoor furniture had been rearranged again, and someone had used his outdoor shower. Wet towels were draped over his fence, and his outdoor refrigerator had been emptied of everything except condiments. He was starting to feel like a prisoner in his own home. Every morning brought new evidence of Linda's intrusions, and every afternoon brought new violation notices with increasing fines. Jake tried reaching out to other homeowners in the neighborhood, hoping to find allies. What he discovered was both enlightening and depressing. Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor, told him she'd been dealing with Linda's harassment for 3 years. "She fined me for having the wrong color mailbox," Mrs. Patterson said. "Then she fined me for taking too long to replace it. Then she fined me because the new one was 2 inches too tall according to some rule she made up." Danny, the neighbor with kids, had his own horror stories. "She made us remove our kids' trampoline because it was visually disruptive," and he said. "Then she fined us for the dead grass where the trampoline had been sitting. We've paid over $2,000 in fines in the past year alone. Why doesn't anyone fight back?" "Because she makes it worse if you do." "My buddy Tom tried to challenge her last year. She started showing up at his house every day, finding new violations. She fined him for his garbage cans being visible from the street, for having one weed in his flower bed, for his house numbers being the wrong font. He finally just moved. Jake felt sick. Linda had turned the entire neighborhood into her personal fiefdom, and everyone was too scared to stand up to her. But Jake also learned something interesting from his neighbors. Linda didn't have a pool. In fact, she'd tried to get the city to approve a variance for a pool in her backyard 2 years ago, but it had been denied because of utility line restrictions. That explained everything. Linda wasn't just power-hungry, she was jealous. She wanted access to a pool, and since she couldn't have her own, she decided to help herself to his. The final straw came the following Monday. Jake arrived home from work to find Linda hosting what could only be described as a pool party in his backyard. There were at least 6 people there, including several he'd never seen before. They had music playing, food spread out on his patio table, and were using his pool like it was a community center. Jake stormed out to confront them, but Linda was ready for him. "This is an official HOA board meeting," she announced loudly. "We're conducting a comprehensive inspection of your pool facilities to ensure they meet safety standards for community use." "Community use? This is private property." "Actually," Linda said, pulling out a folder full of papers, "according to the county records, your pool was installed with permits that classified it as a neighborhood amenity. That means it's subject to community access requirements." Jake had no idea if that was true or not, but he was pretty sure Linda was making it up. The problem was she sounded so confident that even he was starting to doubt himself. "I want everyone out of my yard right now," he said firmly. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Linda replied. "This is official HOA business, and interfering with HOA operations is grounds for immediate legal action." Jake looked around at the group of people who had taken over his backyard. They were all watching him with expressions that ranged from amusement to pity. He realized that Linda had turned him into a neighborhood spectacle. As he walked back into his house, Jake heard Linda announce to her group, "Some homeowners just don't understand what it means to be part of a community." That night, Jake sat in his living room, staring at a stack of violation notices that now totaled over $1,500 in fines. His peaceful suburban dream had turned into a nightmare, and Linda Walsh was holding all the cards. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. If Linda wanted to play dirty, he could play dirty too. He just needed to be smarter about it. It was time to fight back. Jake spent the entire weekend planning his revenge. He wasn't going to let Linda continue terrorizing him and his neighbors. But he knew he had to be smart about it. Linda had been playing this game for years. She knew all the angles and had all the connections. He needed to outsmart her at her own game. First, Jake did his homework. He spent hours researching HOA law, property rights, and public records. What he discovered was eye-opening. Nearly every violation Linda had issued to him was legally invalid. The HOA had no right to demand access to his property for inspections. There was no county record classifying his pool as a neighborhood amenity. And security cameras were explicitly protected. Under state privacy laws, Linda had been counting on homeowners not knowing their rights. She'd built her little empire on lies and intimidation, but Jake also discovered something even more interesting. As HOA president, Linda was required to keep detailed records of all violations, fines, and how the money was spent. She was supposed to file annual reports with the state and make financial records available to homeowners upon request. Jake submitted a formal request for all HOA financial records from the past 3 years. When Linda tried to refuse, he pointed out that state law required her to provide them within 10 business days or face legal penalties. The records that finally arrived were a mess. Thousands of dollars in violation fees had been collected, but the accounting was sloppy and incomplete. More importantly, Jake noticed some suspicious patterns. Many of the biggest fines coincidentally happened right before Linda made major purchases for community improvements, like new outdoor furniture that looked suspiciously similar to what she had on her own patio. Armed with this information, Jake started building his case, but he also started planning something more immediate. He'd studied Linda's schedule carefully, and he knew exactly when she'd strike next. Linda always showed up on Tuesday and Thursday mornings when most people were at work. She'd gotten comfortable with her routine, probably thinking Jake had given up trying to stop her. Jake took vacation days for the rest of the week. On Monday night, he began preparing his surprise. The first part of his plan was inspired by his college chemistry classes. Jake researched pool additives that were completely harmless to humans, but would create visible temporary effects. He found exactly what he needed: a food-grade dye compound that would react with chlorine to create a bright, temporary color change on skin and fabric. It was the same stuff used in some novelty bath products, completely safe but impossible to ignore. Jake carefully measured and added the compound to his pool Monday night. The water looked perfectly normal, but anyone who spent time in it would emerge with a bright green tint that would last for several days. The second part of his plan involved technology. Jake had noticed that Linda always brought her phone and often took pictures of herself in his pool, probably for social media. He set up a wireless network with the name Linda's Illegal Pool Parties that would be visible to anyone looking for Wi-Fi in his backyard. But the most important part of his plan involved gathering witnesses. Jake had been doing some investigative work around the neighborhood, and he discovered that Linda had way more enemies than friends. There was Tony Rodriguez, a local reporter for the community newspaper who'd been trying to write a story about HOA corruption for months. Jake had contacted him anonymously and provided copies of all the questionable financial records. There was also Patricia Mills, a retired lawyer who lived 2 streets over. Linda had fined her $800 the previous year for having non-approved landscaping. Patricia had been looking for a way to take Linda down ever since. Jake had carefully coordinated with both of them. Tony would arrive Thursday morning at exactly 9:30 with his camera. Patricia would show up 15 minutes later with a folder full of legal documents, but Jake's secret weapon was something he'd discovered completely by accident. While researching Linda's background, he'd found out that she'd been posting photos and videos of herself in his pool on her social media accounts. She'd been bragging to her online friends about her private pool access and posting pictures of herself lounging in what she described as her personal oasis. Jake had screenshots of everything. Linda had basically created a digital record of her own trespassing. On Wednesday night, Jake made his final preparations. He adjusted his security cameras to get the best possible angles. He prepared a folder with all his evidence: the financial records, the screenshots, the invalid violation notices, and documentation of his property rights. Most importantly, he set up his sprinkler system with a special timer. The sprinklers were designed to water his landscaping, but Jake had repositioned them so they'd also spray anyone near the pool area. He could activate them remotely using an app on his phone. Thursday morning arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, warm temperature, exactly the kind of day Linda loved for her illegal pool parties. Jake positioned himself at his bedroom window with his phone and a pair of binoculars. At 8:45, he saw Linda's front door open. She emerged wearing a bright yellow bikini and carrying her usual oversized beach bag, but this time she wasn't alone. Linda had brought 3 friends with her, just like Jake had hoped she would. The more witnesses to her behavior, the better. The group made their way across the street and around to Jake's side gate. Jake had deliberately left the new lock loose, making it easy for Linda to cut through. He wanted her to feel confident and comfortable. At exactly 9 o'clock, Linda and her friends entered Jake's backyard. They spread out towels, set up their music, and started treating the place like their private resort. Jake watched as Linda pulled out her phone and started taking selfies. She was completely relaxed, probably thinking Jake had finally given up fighting her. At 9:15, Linda and 2 of her friends got into the pool. Jake waited until they were fully submerged and swimming around before he sent a text message to Tony and Patricia. Show's starting. Jake gave Linda and her friends enough time to really enjoy themselves. He wanted them completely absorbed in their illegal pool party when the surprises started. At 9:25, Jake saw Tony Rodriguez walking up his driveway with a professional camera. Tony positioned himself where he could see into the backyard through the fence slats. At 9:30, Jake activated his sprinkler system. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Water suddenly erupted from multiple sprinkler heads, soaking everything in the backyard. Linda and her friends shrieked as they were drenched by the powerful spray. But the real surprise came when they climbed out of the pool. The chemical compound Jake had added to the water had done its job perfectly. All 3 women emerged from the pool with bright green skin and hair. Their swimsuits were stained the same vivid green color. Linda started screaming immediately. "What did you do to your pool?"
"This is assault!"
"I'm calling the police." That's when Patricia Mills walked into the backyard through the open gate. carrying her legal documents and wearing her biggest smile. "Actually, Mrs. Walsh," Patricia said calmly, "you're the one who should be worried about the police. What you're doing here is called criminal trespassing." Tony Rodriguez appeared next, camera in hand, snapping photos of the green-stained women and the obvious signs of their unauthorized pool party. "I'm Tony Rodriguez from the Community Herald," he announced. "I'm doing a story on HOA corruption. Would you care to comment on why you're swimming in someone else's pool without permission?" Linda's face turned as red as her skin was green. She grabbed her beach bag and started stuffing her wet belongings into it. "This is harassment," she shouted. "I'm conducting official HOA business." "Actually," Patricia said, pulling out a document, "I have a copy of the official HOA bylaws right here. There's nothing that gives you the right to use private property for personal recreation." Jake finally emerged from his house, carrying his folder of evidence. He felt calmer than he had in weeks. "Morning, Linda," he said pleasantly. "How's the water today?" Linda pointed a green-stained finger at him. "You poisoned your pool? That's illegal." "Actually, that's just food coloring," Jake replied. "Completely harmless. I can show you the safety data sheets if you'd like." Tony was taking pictures of everything. The green women, the pool party setup, the evidence that Linda had been treating Jake's property as her personal playground. "Mrs. Walsh," Tony said, "I have documentation showing that you've collected over $50,000 in questionable fines from homeowners in this neighborhood. Would you like to explain where that money went?" Linda's green face went pale. She grabbed her friends and started pushing them toward the gate. "This isn't over," she hissed at Jake. "Actually, it is," Patricia said, handing Linda an official-looking document. "This is a cease and desist order. If you set foot on Mr. Jake's property again, you'll be arrested for criminal trespassing." As Linda and her green-stained friends fled the backyard, Jake felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in months. But he knew this was just the beginning. Linda's humiliation was about to become very, very public. The photo of Linda Walsh emerging from Jake's pool with bright green skin made the front page of the Community Herald the next day. Tony Rodriguez had captured the perfect shot. Linda's shocked expression, her vivid green complexion, and the obvious signs of her unauthorized pool party spread out behind her. The headline read, "HOA President Caught Swimming in Homeowner's Pool Without Permission." The article detailed everything: Linda's pattern of harassment, the invalid fines, the suspicious financial records, and her brazen trespassing. But the real explosion happened when the story went viral online. Jake hadn't expected social media to pick up the story, but by Friday afternoon, the photo and article were being shared thousands of times. The image of the green-stained HOA president became an instant meme, with people adding captions like, "When you're so entitled you turn green with envy," and "This is what happens when Karens think they own everything." Linda's own social media posts came back to haunt her spectacularly. People found her old photos bragging about her private pool access and started sharing them alongside the green pool incident. The comments were brutal. "So this is what a pool thief looks like. Imagine being so jealous of your neighbor that you break into their yard to use their pool. The audacity is unreal. She was fining him while stealing from him." The story caught the attention of a local TV news station, and by Saturday morning, a reporter was knocking on Jake's door asking for an interview. Jake agreed, but he made sure to keep the focus on the bigger issue. This wasn't just about him. It was about Linda's years of abusing her power and terrorizing homeowners throughout the neighborhood. She created a system where she could do whatever she wanted, Jake told the reporter. She was using HOA rules as a weapon while breaking the law herself. The TV segment aired on Sunday evening, and it included interviews with several other homeowners who had been victimized by Linda's schemes. Mrs. Patterson talked about the hundreds of dollars in invalid fines she'd paid. Danny described how Linda had forced him to remove his children's playground equipment. Patricia Mills provided legal context about how Linda had exceeded her authority. The segment also revealed the results of Tony Rodriguez's investigation into the HOA's finances. Over $50,000 in fines had been collected over 3 years, but the money trail was questionable at best. Much of it had been spent on community improvements that seemed to benefit Linda personally. By Monday morning, Linda's phone was ringing nonstop. Jake could see her across the street, pacing around her living room with her curtains drawn. The green tint on her skin had faded somewhat, but it was still clearly visible. That afternoon, Jake received a call from the HOA management company. "Mr. Jake, this is Carol from Summit Property Management. I'm calling to inform you that all fines previously issued to your property have been voided pending a full review of HOA procedures." "What about Linda Walsh?" "Mrs. Walsh has submitted her resignation as HOA president effective immediately. The board will be conducting a complete audit of all financial records and violation procedures." Jake felt a surge of satisfaction, but the best news was yet to come. On Tuesday, Patricia Mills called with an update. "Jake, I thought you'd want to know. I'm representing a class action lawsuit against Linda Walsh and the previous HOA board. We're seeking restitution for all the invalid fines plus damages for harassment and abuse of authority." "How many people are involved?" "So far, 23 homeowners. And the number keeps growing. Linda really made a lot of enemies over the years." By Wednesday, the story had reached the state attorney general's office. An investigation was launched into potential criminal charges related to Linda's financial management of the HOA funds. Jake watched from his window as investigators carried boxes of documents out of Linda's house. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood with fake violations and entitled behavior was finally facing real consequences. But the ultimate vindication came on Friday afternoon. Jake was working in his backyard, finally able to enjoy his pool in peace when his doorbell rang. It was a process server with legal documents. Linda was suing him for assault with a chemical weapon, claiming the food coloring he'd added to his pool had caused her severe emotional distress and permanent skin damage. Jake called Patricia Mills immediately. "Don't worry about it," Patricia laughed. "This is exactly the kind of desperate move I expected from her. She's trying to distract from her own legal problems. What if she wins? She won't. You have every right to add food coloring to your own pool water. And we have photographs of her trespassing, plus all her social media posts bragging about using your pool illegally. No jury in the world would side with her." Patricia was right. When Linda's lawsuit finally went to court 6 months later, it was dismissed in less than an hour. The judge actually lectured Linda about frivolous litigation and ordered her to pay Jake's legal fees. The class action lawsuit against Linda was more successful. She was ordered to pay back over $40,000 in invalid fines plus additional damages. She was also banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. The criminal investigation resulted in charges for embezzlement and abuse of authority. Linda eventually pleaded guilty to avoid jail time, but she received 5 years of probation and was required to perform community service. The green skin incident became legendary in their neighborhood. New homeowners heard the story as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. Children dared each other to swim in pools after adding food coloring, hoping to turn green like the pool lady. Linda and her husband eventually moved away, unable to handle the constant recognition and mockery. The house sat empty for months before they finally found a buyer. The neighborhood itself changed dramatically. The new HOA board implemented strict oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. Homeowners became more engaged, attending meetings and questioning expenses. The culture of fear that Linda had created was replaced by one of accountability and transparency. Jake never had another problem with unauthorized pool use. His security cameras captured the occasional curious neighbor peering over the fence, but nobody was brave enough to actually trespass after seeing what happened to Linda. A year later, Jake hosted a neighborhood pool party to celebrate the anniversary of Linda's humiliation. Nearly 50 people showed up, including Tony Rodriguez, Patricia Mills, and all the neighbors who had been terrorized by Linda's reign of terror. Mrs. Patterson brought green-colored cupcakes. Danny's kids wore green swimsuits. Even Patricia Mills brought green lemonade. "To Jake," Patricia announced, raising her glass, "for showing us that bullies can be stopped when good people fight back." As Jake looked around at his neighbors enjoying his backyard, with his permission this time, he reflected on how much had changed. A year ago, he'd been a victim of Linda's entitled behavior, feeling helpless and alone. Now he was part of a community that had learned to stand up for itself. The pool incident had cost Linda everything: her position, her reputation, her finances, and ultimately her home. All because she couldn't respect basic boundaries and thought she was above the rules she enforced on others. Jake had learned an important lesson too. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully isn't to give in or move away. Sometimes you have to be smarter, more patient, and more determined than they are. As the sun set over his backyard full of laughing neighbors, Jake smiled. His pool had finally become what he'd always dreamed it would be, a source of joy and community. Just not in the way Linda Walsh had imagined. The entitled HOA president who thought she could take whatever she wanted had learned a very expensive lesson about respecting other people's property. And she'd learned it in the most humiliating way possible, by turning green with her own greed and having the whole world see it.